The point is that eventually, I'm hoping that you will read these studies on vicarious reinforcement and punishment effects, and they'll contribute to this little niche of knowledge in this very small area of research. I attended the CalABA conference a couple of weeks ago, and it was very interesting because most of the questions that people asked me, other than about our own work, were about a particular set of studies that has been published recently. And they wanted my reaction to these studies. And I sort of gave it, and as I'm having more and more conversations with people, it appeared to me that some claims have been made that have gone well beyond published data, to the point where I felt obliged to say something about it. And as long as this is my last talk, I might as well go out in flames. So basically, here it is. I'm going to speak about a general procedure that has gone by several names. One of them was the synthesized functional assessment. In a more recent publication, it was renamed the IISCA, Interview-Informed Synthesized Contingency Assessment. In my reading and consideration of the data and the claims that have been made, my own view is that it's this: problem behavior meets alternative science. What's alternative science? You have been hearing in the news a lot about alternative facts. This is alternative science. Okay, now, this is a particular line of research, and unfortunately, it's a line of research that is only coming out of one laboratory. And so it may appear as though my comments are taking on a sort of personal sort of slant. And let me just mention a couple of things about that. First of all, I'm a data guy, which basically means that most of my work has been empirical in nature. And as a result, I understand the importance of staying close to your data. That is, we say, these are the methods, these are the results. These methods might be useful for answering some other questions, and these results raise other questions that you may want to pursue. We try not to go very far beyond the data, and I believe, therefore, that when people do that, they should encounter the consequences of doing so. Now, if this is a very young researcher starting out, no problem. Let's see if they learn. If it is, however, a senior researcher, especially a researcher who may influence other researchers, I believe it's important to basically call that out. Second, although it may appear that I am speaking behind someone's back, and I actually am, I'm not saying anything that has not been said directly to this person or been written to this person. And third, to use the words of the Corleone family, it's not personal, it's just business. All right, so let's go back in history. Behavior modification around 1970. Most of you were not around in 1970. In 1970, I knew nothing about operant conditioning. I was still an undergraduate student. And I call it behavior modification because back at that time, you could consider behavior modification and applied behavior analysis to be basically synonymous and indistinguishable. So back at that point in time, we encounter a problem behavior. What do we do about it? Well, let's see if we can fix it. And in fixing it, we will do several things. Let's find out what the topographical aspects of the behavior are. We'll do that perhaps by interviewing parents or teachers. We'll then conduct some observations to see if we can identify the context in which behavior occurs, and we will establish a baseline. We will do anything we can to get that behavior to happen. Why? So we can use that as an index of response prior to intervention. We will then implement a treatment plan, and that treatment is going to consist typically of some combination of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement timeout, response cost, and so forth. Now, that particular approach to dealing with behavior was extremely successful. It basically laid the groundwork for our field. So I'm not going to criticize it because it produced a lot of successes. However, we also encountered occasional treatment failures, and that is failures with just about every procedure we might want to use. So for example, it was shown that timeout was not necessarily effective every time it was implemented. Response cost was also ineffective occasionally. DRA was ineffective. DRO was ineffective, and non-contingent reinforcement was also effective. So basically, those are all the procedures that we might use to reduce behavior. It was shown in one or more studies that each of those procedures does not necessarily always produce therapeutic effects. The question is why, or the question was why, and the answer is we weren't really sure. There's no reason to believe the procedures were not implemented according to protocol, because these were all very careful researchers. There must have been something about the response or the context in which it was applied, intervention was applied, that made the behavior insensitive to whatever that manipulation was. Now, along with the successes that were published and the occasional failures that were published, there were other studies that sort of were occasionally seen that identified some interesting functional relations. And I'm just going to highlight 3 of those early studies. One set was published by Iwata, who showed that a severe problem behavior such as self-injury could be maintained by inadvertent attention delivered by caretakers. Another set of studies was done by Ted Carr, who showed that a different problem behavior, aggression, happened to be maintained by a different contingency. In this case, it was not positive reinforcement, but rather negative reinforcement. And the third set of studies was conducted by a developmental psychologist, Gershon Bergson. I consider him to be a behavior analyst in disguise. He did some very, very interesting studies on stereotypic behavior and showed that it was maintained by the sensory consequences that it produced, or what we would call automatic reinforcement. Now, eventually, we stepped into the picture, and we were not conducting incidental studies on problem behavior, but rather, we were attempting to develop a program focusing on one particular problem, and that was self-injury. Having read these studies and other studies like them, it occurred to us that problem behavior such as self-injury could be maintained by positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or automatic reinforcement. We did not know. So what we did was we exposed the behavior to all of those sorts of contingencies to see what happened, and you know how the story goes. What we found was that sure enough, self-injurious behavior occasionally was maintained by each of those different contingencies. Now, the common feature among all these studies was the inclusion of a test condition that isolated a particular contingency of reinforcement. Now, what would have happened had we just assumed that self-injurious behavior was maintained by positive reinforcement that had been demonstrated by Iwata? We would have identified the functions of some self-injurious behavior, but not all of them. What would have happened if we combined all the contingencies together into one test condition? I'm not sure what would have happened. Now, let's move forward. Applied behavior analysis up to the current day. If someone exhibits a problem behavior, we now have a generally different way of approaching it. We still may conduct an interview, we still may do some observations, but what we also do is conduct a functional analysis to identify the contingency that maintains problem behavior. We then implement an intervention that does not simply consist of a random combination of procedures, but rather procedures that are selected because they will eliminate or they will neutralize the contingency that we have identified And as a result of adopting this particular approach to looking at problem behavior, our success rate has gone up. There's absolutely no question about that. I could cite a number of studies on this, but I'll just basically refer you to the review paper that Saul Axelrod published in JAVA in 1999. Now, this particular approach to looking at behavior also allowed us to explain some of the early failures that were obtained using these reinforcement procedures. So, for example, it has been shown that procedural variations of extinction are function specific. I could include a long list, but I'll just basically mention one. That is, extinction for behavior maintained by positive reinforcement will be ineffective if applied to behavior maintained by negative reinforcement. The same thing is true for extinction basically designed for one function applied to any other function. Similarly, variations of differential reinforcement are also function specific. It's been shown that teaching an individual to man for a positive reinforcer has no effect on problem behavior maintained by negative reinforcement. The implication of all of this work is that the contingency that maintains problem behavior should be identified during assessment. Why? Because identifying that contingency helps us to identify the stimulus that needs to be withheld when putting together an extinction program, and the stimulus that needs to be delivered when implementing a differential reinforcement program. Okay, now let's move to the particular study that I would like to discuss with you today, published in 2014. It was a study on assessment of problem behavior, and I'm going to go through it in a couple different ways and then talk about some substantive work. So what basically was the logic of this particular approach to looking at behavior? If you read the introduction, you will clearly find the following. That indirect approaches to assessment are basically not very satisfactory. Why? Because they are unreliable. That's a fact. No one's going to dispute that fact. So what we will do is we will replace these unreliable rating scales with an open-ended interview that lasts for somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes. And what's the evidence that the interview is going to be more reliable than a rating scale? The descriptive analysis. We will not do descriptive analyses because results of a number of studies have shown that outcomes of descriptive analyses generally do not correspond with outcomes of functional analyses. So instead of conducting a descriptive analysis, let's basically conduct some unstructured observation that may last from 15 to 30 minutes to get an idea of the context in which behavior occurs. What about the functional analysis? Well, it was mentioned in the article that that is, a number of different test conditions or isolated test conditions are unnecessary to develop an intervention plan. So let's replace them with a single synthesized test condition that is put together based on the outcome of the interview that was conducted. Now, before getting into the details of the study, we can just basically consider these components in intervention and ask about their origin. So what is the historical basis for the old components and new components? Let's look at the old components, the traditional FBA components. Rating scales. Rating scales have been evaluated in at least 50 studies published over the years. We know that they're not particularly reliable. How do we know that they're not particularly reliable? We know that because people generally use the same type of rating scale. They agree on the questions that are going to be posed. They have to do that in order to determine whether or not the respondent provides a consistent answer. So it's not simply that we are asking questions during a 30 to 45-minute interview, but rather we are asking a particular set of questions whose value we can then evaluate, at least in terms of reliability. Descriptive analyses. At least 100 studies have been published on the use of descriptive analysis. We know that, in general, the outcome of a descriptive analysis does not correspond very well to the outcome of a functional analysis. How do we know that? Because we have defined the descriptive analysis techniques very carefully, so we know how data are taken, and in addition to that, we know that the data from the descriptive analysis are highly reliable. What about the functional analysis? Well, there have been well over 500 studies published evaluating functional analyses with severe problem behaviors, and I think it's worth noting that well over 20 centers each have published well over 10 studies, so that the utility of that particular approach has been established over and over again across a variety of different implementations. Now, what about the assessment components that were recommended in this particular article? If you read the article, you may recall that the authors stated that the purpose of the study was to use a particular model that had been described before. Where had it been described? In 2 chapters and in a review article. Those were the citations for this new approach to conducting a functional behavioral assessment. All right, let's go on to the study details. There were only 3 participants, and those 3 participants were kind of interesting. If you pay attention to the methodological aspects of the study, they all spoke in full sentences. They all followed multiple-step instructions, and the problem behaviors all consisted of tantrums, noncompliance, screaming, throwing, and aggression. All of the problem behaviors were aggregated. So basically, what have we got? We do not have individuals with severe or profound developmental disabilities who could not speak, who are engaging in problem behaviors likely to be maintained by automatic reinforcement. We have 3 brats who are engaging in tantrums. You give me a brat engaging in a tantrum, and I can tell you pretty quickly whether or not that behavior is maintained by positive or negative reinforcement. But it's got to be maintained by a social contingency. There's absolutely no question about that. Okay, the assessment process consisted of the interview, the observation, and the synthesized assessment. And I basically listed the conditions to which these individuals were exposed on the slide. Gail was exposed to several conditions. In one of them, problem behavior resulted in access to attention plus access to a tangible item. So it was a combination of 2 positive reinforcements. She was also exposed to a condition in which only attention was delivered as positive reinforcement or consequence, and another condition in which only the tangible item was delivered. All right, so there's tangibles by themselves, attention by itself, and the attention plus tangibles. Dale was exposed to a condition that consisted of escape from demands, access to tangibles, and access to attention. Bob was exposed to a condition that consisted of escape from past demands, and access to attention. So 2 individuals were exposed to combined contingencies of positive and negative reinforcement. The 3rd individual was exposed to a condition of combined positive reinforcement. And I put an asterisk next to Gail's name because Gail's data were used to support the necessity of using a combined contingencies. If you read the article, it was stated that when Gail was exposed to just a tangible contingency, problem behavior didn't occur. When Gail was exposed to the attention contingency, problem behavior didn't occur. It was the combined contingency that resulted in problem behavior. Well, yes, possibly. However, there's another detail in the study that one needs to remember, and that is non-contingent tangibles were present in the attention condition, and non-contingent attention was present in the tangible condition. And it has been shown that access to one positive reinforcer may basically obliterate deprivation from another positive reinforcer. That is, my problem behavior may be maintained by attention, but as long as I have access to tangibles, then I'm not really going to engage in attention-maintained problem behavior. So we don't really know anything about Gail's data and whether or not it was necessary to expose her to the combined attention and tangible condition. Now, let's go past that particular study and look at some other studies that have been conducted. And I'm going to focus on 2 replications. One was a replication that was just recently published, and I selected it because it was a large-scale replication. And let's just take a quick look at the details of those studies. The subject characteristics. There were 30, well, there really weren't 30 individuals, there were 30 problem behaviors. Several individuals were evaluated twice. But in terms of the 30, 3 were nonverbal, 12 spoke in full sentences, and 15 were somewhere in between. So if you look at the group as a whole, generally we would say this group basically had a fair amount of communication skills. All right, so they were not what one would consider to be severely impaired from the standpoint of language. What about their problem behaviors? 26 of the individuals' problem behaviors were aggregated together. If you consider the other 4, only one of the other 4 responses was likely to be maintained by automatic reinforcement. And that was one case of self-injurious behavior. There were no cases of stereotypic behavior. The others were aggressive behavior or screaming behavior. And if you look at the procedures and outcomes, 25 showed that problem behavior was high in a condition that consisted of combined contingencies. 1 engaged in problem behavior during a positive reinforcement condition only. 4, and 1 engaged in problem behavior during a negative reinforcement condition only. But these were the only conditions to which the individuals were exposed. And so basically we have 30 replications of this approach to conducting a functional assessment. Now, let's take a look at a different replication, or attempted replication. It turned out that this replication was published in the same issue, and it was authored by the individual who served as the associate editor for the original 2014 article. Basically, Wayne Fisher. So what did Wayne Fisher and colleagues do? They selected 5 individuals who engaged in aggression, SIB, or property destruction, and they conducted 2 assessments. One of them was a more typical functional analysis. They first screened for whether problem behavior was maintained by automatic reinforcement, and if it was, the individual exited the study. If not, they then conducted a typical functional analysis in which they determined whether problem behavior was maintained by either positive or negative reinforcement. They then conducted a, quote, synthesized assessment using the interview, descriptive analysis, and combined contingency approach, and these were their results. 3 individuals' problem behavior was found to be maintained solely by positive reinforcement using the typical functional analysis method. Their problem behavior was found to be maintained by combined control when exposed to the synthesized assessment. 1 individual's problem behavior was maintained separately by positive and negative reinforcement. That individual's problem behavior also appeared to be maintained by multiple control when exposed to the combined contingency. And the last individual did not engage in problem behavior during either one of those assessment sequences. So Wayne basically came to the following conclusions. First of all, the synthesized assessment seems to be prone toward multiple control. In cases where an outcome was observed, 4 out of 4 were multiple control. That had to be because that was the only condition to which they were exposed. More important than that, the synthesized assessment appeared to be prone to false positive outcomes. Those 4 individuals' problem behavior was not maintained by multiple control. 3 was maintained by positive reinforcement, 1 was maintained by positive and negative reinforcement separately. And although this was a negative finding, I think it was a fairly significant finding. The one case where the functional analysis failed to identify a contingency was also a case where the synthesized assessment failed to show any reliable outcome. And the reason why I think that's important was that that was the opportunity for the synthesized assessment to show that it was superior to the functional analysis. Right? The functional analysis showed a negative result. What happened with the synthesized assessment? Same thing, negative result. And as a result of that, Wayne came to the conclusion that interventions that are driven by this particular approach to assessment are highly likely to contain either irrelevant or incorrect components. Okay, here is my critique of the synthesized assessment model. First of all, it is not based on a large amount of empirical work, but if you go to the 2014 article, the citations were 2 chapters and a review. Next, the reliability of the rating scales. The argument was made in the 2014 article that rating scales are unreliable. That's a reasonable argument. Now, if you want to substitute something else, then I'll ask the question, how reliable is your interview? All right, and what data were presented to indicate that that interview had any degree of reliability? Next, if you're going to argue that the descriptive analysis does not produce valid outcomes, that's okay. I mean, that's consistent with data. But then if you were going to suggest that we should conduct as an alternative a particular kind of observation, then what is the validity of that kind of observation? It was stated at least 3 times in the article that the assessment conditions were selected based on the interview and separate conditions were not conducted because the interviews did not suggest that separate contingencies maintain problem behavior. Well, if the functional analysis conditions are all selected based on the interview, and if the general strategy here is to try to reduce the amount of time that we're spending on assessment, then my question is, why are we even doing a functional analysis? Let's just do the interview and move on to intervention. The functional analysis, or the functional assessment, illustrated in this particular approach, involves confounded social contingencies. Aggregated problem behavior maintained by social contingencies must occur. Right? A great deal has been made of the fact that the model results in positive outcomes fast. Well, that has to happen. It's a guaranteed outcome when the problem behaviors are all maintained by social contingencies. Next, everything looks like it's combined control, because that's basically the condition to which people are being exposed. And finally, problem behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement is going to be completely insensitive to this particular model. When we ask parents about problem behavior, and if that problem behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement, what are the parents going to say? Well, I don't know when it occurs, or it seems to occur in a variety of different conditions, namely when a person is not getting attention, when not presenting task demands. We will combine those social contingencies, we will expose their behavior to it, and what kind of behavior are we going to see? We will see behavior. So it looks like behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement is in fact maintained by multiple control. Okay. Now, beyond the published data, and this is why a number of people ask me about this particular approach at CalABA, they refer me to a website that now is up and running, where you can basically read about this particular model. You can read about testimonies from therapists who have applied this particular approach. And so I've looked at that and I've listened, and it seems to me that I should, and even if I shouldn't, I will, comment about rhetoric outside the review process. These are claims about this particular approach that do not appear in published articles. And basically, as far as I can tell, there are 4 of them. One of them is all models are wrong. The next one is the meal analogy. The third one is a typical functional analysis is not helpful. And the 4th one is a typical functional analysis is not socially valid. So let me go through these very quickly. All models are wrong. This is in slides on this website. And the citation was to Box and Draper. Does anyone know who Box and Draper are? No. They're statisticians. And they were writing about statistical models. The premises are this. All models are wrong, to some degree. A typical functional analysis is a model, and therefore a typical functional analysis is wrong. I think you can all see the logic there, right? Here's my response. What is the relevance of statistical modeling to functional analysis methods? It's okay to basically cite a pronouncement and a publication, but if that's true, what about going to that publication and reading it, which I've done? And basically, Box and Weber are talking about statistical models and how statistical models contain certain errors, which means that all statistical models are wrong. Well, functional analysis is not a statistical model. It's simply the use of a method to answer a question, how does the world work? Or does the world work this way? And we answer that question by doing something and seeing whether or not it produces a particular outcome. Could that experimental method be wrong? It could be wrong. But if I want to answer the question, how does the world work? Or does it work this way? I'll take that particular approach. I think generally it will get me to the right place. All right, so much for all models are wrong. The next one is the meal analogy. What's that one about? Basically, it goes like this. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. If one wanted to eat a sandwich, one does not take a teaspoonful of flour and gobble it down, because the flour would eventually make the bread, right? One does not eat a teaspoon of mustard, and one does not do that for all ingredients that will be found in that sandwich. Instead, basically, one eats the sandwich. And one enjoys the fact that all of the parts have been combined. And if the parts had not been combined, you would not have that sandwich. All right? So my reply is, okay, fine. I agree. If we are eating sandwiches, that's okay. But what if you're the person who has to make that sandwich? All right? Or what if someone made you a bad sandwich and now you need to fix that sandwich? What would you do? Under those conditions, I believe it will be helpful to know what goes into a sandwich, because we're not simply eating it. We're responsible for doing something, right, to produce an actual sandwich that somebody else might want to eat. The typical functional analysis is not helpful. This is the way that one goes. If a functional analysis is not helpful, few people will use it. And it was basically mentioned that practitioners often do not use functional analysis. In fact, that's true. Two recently published surveys, have established the fact that although behavior analysts basically appreciate the fact that the functional analysis is a gold standard, they don't often do a functional analysis. And so because they don't do functional analysis, it must be the case that functional analyses are not helpful. I think you see the problem with the logic there. All right, here's my reply. Practitioners also do not usually assess the reliability of all their data, correct? Now, does that mean the assessment of reliability of data is not useful? No, it's just that there are different standards that are applied for research versus simple clinical practice. And were I a clinician, I would not necessarily do a functional analysis for all of my cases, namely when presented with a brat who is engaging in tantrums. And I wouldn't necessarily collect reliability data for all of my outcomes either. Okay, the last one. The typical functional analysis is socially valid. And basically, here's the claim, and this was actually stated in the website. 0 studies have shown a socially validated effect on problem behavior when the standard functional analysis was used. Right? That word was used. 0 studies have shown a socially validated effect. Now, if one were to say that, what's the implication? The implication is that functional analysis studies actually have been shown to have poor social validity, correct? That's basically what is being implied. Let's take a look at that implication. First of all, it's a misleading claim. How many functional analysis studies have assessed social validity and failed to obtain positive outcome? Answer, 0. 0. Now, not only is that claim misleading, it is an alternative fact. It is basically completely inaccurate. Now, I did not have to spend half a day or even half an hour to find that that was an inaccurate claim. I knew that when I read it. Why? If you're familiar with David Wacker's work, anyone who is familiar with David Wacker's work knows several things. One, he's conducted a lot of research on the use of functional analyses. Two, almost all of his work is done in outpatient clinics with parents. And three, as a result, he is one of the few researchers in their field that occasionally collects social validity data on his procedures. So all I had to do was to look up a handful of Dave Wacker's publications that are listed right there. All of them basically collected social validity data, and all of them reported that parents loved the outcome of intervention. Now, let me back up. There aren't a lot of examples of studies in which social validity data have been collected when a functional analysis has been used. And what you might think is, well, the functional analysis people don't collect social validity data, whereas most other people do. That's not true either. Because if you look at a study published by Jim Carr, a review article, basically he looked at the studies in which social validity data have been reported, and he found that since about the 1980s, 12% of articles published in JAMA report social validity data. And so it is typically the case that a large majority of researchers simply don't conduct assessments of social validity. Why is that? There are lots of reasons for that. I'm not going to go into that today. So in conclusion, here's my take. The synthesized assessment model is based on faulty logic, scant data, confounded analysis with a biased sample. I tried to get everything there in one sentence. Claims about the method have been highly exaggerated and inaccurate, both in published data and beyond the data. No one is buying in. If you look at the replications, who has replicated or attempted to replicate that particular procedure? Basically, all of the replications with positive outcomes are coming out of one lab. The one attempted replication, conducted by a different lab, basically produced results urging extreme caution in the use of this particular model. Now, I'm not sure what is going on in terms of research nowadays, but Wayne Fisher was, I think, very thorough and careful in his attempt to compare the results of this synthesized assessment with a more typical functional analysis in dealing with actual problem behavior. But you don't really have to look at problem behavior to answer the general question of what would happen if you expose behavior maintained by one contingency to a different contingency. So what would happen if problem behavior maintained by positive reinforcement is exposed to combined positive and negative reinforcement? Are you going to see behavior? Yes, you're going to see behavior. What about behavior maintained by negative reinforcement? You expose that to combined positive and negative reinforcement. Are you going to see behavior? Yes, you will see behavior. Now, what about behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement? You expose it to positive or negative reinforcement. What will you see? The answer is I'm not sure. All right, but I suspect about half the time you're going to see problem behavior, because problem behavior will be completely insensitive to those contingencies, and it will occur nevertheless. So in closing, I'm going to go back to my very first slide. The synthesized assessment model closely resembles behavior modification the way I showed you back in the 1970s. We have a problem behavior. What would we do? We ask some questions, we observe a bit, we see if we can get problem behavior to occur, and then we throw a treatment package out. So we have come full circle.